Our second session for this evening is a conversation titled Matike Mai Aotearoa and the Art of Constitutional Transformation. And it's a pleasure to welcome artist Luke Willis Thompson. The session will be moderated by Megan Tamati-Quennell, curator of modern and contemporary Maori and Indigenous art, and Sharjah Biennial 16 co-curator. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Thank you.
Tēnā rā koutou e te iwi i ngā āuatanga o tō tātou rā. Thank you for being here tonight. So kia ora, warm Pacific greetings to everyone here and to, of course, Luke, who I'd like to kind of introduce just briefly. Luke is an artist who I've long admired. I was first taken with his work he created called In This Hole, on This Island, Where I Am. That involved you taking a journey in a taxi, parked outside the art gallery to a property in Epsom, and then back to the gallery. I think that was about like 2012. The house you quickly and uncomfortably learned was Luke's childhood home and where his family still lived. Also a later work, Sukumati, which meant born dead, which also mined a further personal history and looked at a complicated history related to indentured labour and the sugarcane industry in Fiji. And then further works, Auto-Portrait and Underscore Human. And what all these works had in common for me was the uneasy places the work went and the uncomfortable conversations they attempted to broker and explore. I think Whakamoemoeā, the new work Luke has made for Te Carry, is similar in that it addresses a conversation that needs to be had but is not comfortable or easy. I like the work personally because I see it as very aspirational, but for some people it could be very confrontational and definitely uncomfortable. So we're just gonna basically have a conversation. Of questions, but we're just gonna kind of play it by ear. So thank you very much, Luke, for your time and for being here. I'm extremely grateful, and also for your contribution to the Biennale. I love that work. I think it's a very powerful work, and I was excited when you wanted to make it. You described the video as a piece of political science fiction or speculative fiction. It's set in the year 2040 on Waitangi Day, and which was really interesting because it's actually the date that the Biennale Te Carry was opened. And it is a work about constitutional transformation. Can you talk about the genesis of this video you have made and the idea of constitutional transformation and why the idea of constitutional transformation is important to you?
Kia ora katoa, Nisa Bolivinaka. I guess before we get into it, I just want to say I'm really honored to be here on this land. I'm really honored to be in a Biennale with Anna and Subhash and Raven and Mara and all my new friends. And I'm really grateful to you, Megan, for asking me what I was up to a couple of years ago. Now to the question. That timing that the show opened on the same day that the work was set, Waitangi Day, like we took that as a total tohu. That was so important to us as a team. And to kind of respond to the question about constitutional transformation and what it means to me, it's a huge question.
It is
but
a huge question.
I kind of came to this work in, I suppose, a kind of plural way, or a pluri-ontological way, which was that I made a film with an amazing editor called Annie Collins, who was the editor for the sort of legendary Māori filmmaker Mira Tamita.
Yeah.
And when we kind of wrapped the project, we went for a walk in the forest, and Annie turned to me and she said, "Luke, do you believe in democracy?" And I said, I'm not sure if I've exactly, I gave an art school-esque answer about not totally being sure, but yes, fundamentally. And she just turned and said, "I don't." And she said that she was a student of Mātua Winiata.
Oh.
And that...
Whatarangi, you talking about?
Whatarangi Winiata. And that in our country there could not exist a just situation where Pākehā told Māori how to govern themselves.
Interesting.
And that was really burnt on my brain. And a couple of years later, I was kind of working on a sort of impossible, unlikely project where I was trying to contact Jacinda Ardern because I wanted to kind of make a film with her or an artwork
That's right,
with her.
I remember that.
But because I took myself so seriously at that point, I started to think very hard, what would I actually ask her?
Oh.
And that is how I kind of came across Matike Mai, which is the next generation of Winiata's thought. And Matike Mai is a kind of blueprint or a kind of dream document by which I think a viable alternative to our current system is proposed, and where fundamentally Pākehā do not tell Māori how to govern themselves.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about Whata, who's a very interesting man, and the ideas that you're talking about in terms of Matike Mai, I first heard about from him. And he is a man who lived in Otaki and set up the first Māori university called Te Whānanga o Raukawa. And he talked about this form of governance, which was very interesting to me, and this kind of two-house system. So I didn't know of Matike Mai until you introduced me, actually, and I was quite interested in that. In the video, you kind of talk about unilateral Crown power ending and New Zealand turning into a plurinational democracy. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that kind of means and how it would roll out?
Yeah. I think one of the important things about Matike Mai is that it's both absolutely new and one of a kind, and totally solely relates to Aotearoa. But there are also kinds of things that inform it, like native life in the United States of America and self-governance there. I don't know too much about it here, but that was something that Moana Jackson, who was the philosopher who produced this document largely. But also places like Bolivia and Evo Morales' revolution. And then like 2 years ago, Chile, I think, proposed the most progressive indigenous constitutional reform, which also at its core had this notion of plurinationalism. Plurinationalism, like, is a it is really the kind of concept that the nation state is not the only way to run, to answer this question of place. And I believe that in Aotearoa, plurinationalism takes on a kind of additional significance that might be more like a kind of pluri-ontological suggestion for governmentality. And what I mean by that is that under Matike Mai, which is obviously what the film is exploring and proposing, under Matike Mai, you don't just have Pākehā, or white New Zealand, and Māori. You don't just have two peoples within some relation. Every single iwi and hapu gets to decide for themselves how they want to be governed, how they want to be led, who their leaders are, which might be a kingitanga, it might be a matriarchy, it might be a democracy, it might be whatever.
I'm interested in that because it kind of operates that way, in a way, within an iwi framework anyway. And what's interesting with that too is there are a lot of young leaders. I remember people like John Ta'u Pārai, who was a tohunga, teaching a whole lot of younger ones, and they're now in positions where they are influencing things. People like Shay Wilson, kind of the protocols and the way in which to operate. I had a cousin, Tahu Pōtaki, who was very young and ran the Ngaitahu Iwi for a long time. He was like the chief executive and was a really interesting guy. So for me, that what you're describing to me that's why I think I enjoy that work too that you've made, because it's not out of the question, if you know what I mean. It's not so far-fetched that you couldn't achieve it.
No, I mean, we're racing ahead. I think it's going to happen. I think it will happen. I think we're already kind of on that train. But one of the things I'm sort of blown away by the thinking is that if Māori have full political power to govern themselves, and that's, 400 odd iwi and hapu,
yeah,
then perhaps the other side, the Kawangatanga sphere, the non-Māori world, might also adopt a kind of Māori version of governance, right? There's nothing to say that the bicameral sphere of, the two peoples need not kind of expand and explode or complicate each other in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, which is interesting, again, because under the Treaty of Waitangi, it's kind of an agreement through the Māori nation, and the different iwi, but also all peoples who are there under the right, under the rights of the treaty, so it's all peoples, it's not just European or a settler colonial society, it's everybody who arrives. It applies to everybody and it's inclusive, which is also what I saw within your work. You talked about that. I want to take you back a little bit. He keeps flashing up on the screen. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about Moana Jackson too, and his role, one in Matike Mai, and who he was, and your kind of interest in this project through him.
Yeah, Moana Jackson was he passed away about 2 months before I began working on the project in earnest, and I of course it's a great shame that I wasn't able to connect with him, but he was a kind of incredible lawyer and a jurisprudence philosopher, and he kind of came to fame. This is my version of his biography. I'm sure there's a more accurate one online, but he kind of came to fame by thinking about the inherent bias in the justice system. And then he worked on the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, He was really kind of like central to that project, although I think at the end he had some misgivings about the ways it was kind of chauffeured down to something less emancipatory, but it's a very fascinating and contradictory document. I often feel like if anyone was to read the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, they might they might themselves prefer those rights. And he finished his career from this proposal from the Iwi Chairs Forum, which was to think about, could a constitution be written? We have an unwritten, we are an unwritten constitution. And could a constitution be written that incorporated Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is of course the founding document and the agreement between Māori and the invaders, he was asked to kind of synthesize. He was asked to kind of there's that. Also, He Whakaputanga, which is our Declaration of Independence. And our Declaration of Independence was in 1835. And, it's like so funny, as a teacher, we always teach the decolonial history as beginning, in the 60s. And we're taught that way, and it's just kind of amazing to reset the clock and say, no, there was the first Declaration of Independence, the decolonial Declaration of Independence began then.
And part of that document basically said that it was really the northern tribes, as I understand it. They basically said, we make the rules here. We need to keep this place safe for the settlers who have arrived, and we need to look after you. But you don't make the rules, we make the rules. So I thought that was kind of interesting again, in the way in which it was overturned, of course, and I think it was signed by King George or someone, so it was ratified as a kind of a treaty earlier. So that's kind of interesting to me too, that forms part of what the Matike Mai
just to finish, so I got a little sidetracked. It's so fascinating. It's totally easy to get sidetracked. But he was given this task, and he formed this working group, which included people like Margaret Mutu and Veronica Tawhai, and many others. And they held 252 hui across the country for 5 years. And a hui is a kind of tribal meeting, and these occurred in absolutely everywhere, from marae to, wherever you might think. And the questions that he was tasked with around the potential rewriting of a constitution, it's not hid, it's like he approached it in this radically open way. Like, how does governance feel to you? Like, how do you feel the state in your life? How do you feel, what flavor of oppression are you experiencing? and this openness was all recorded, all transcribed. And from there, Matike Mai was this blueprint. It's a PDF, it's available, everyone can download it, that proposes a kind of constitutional transformation based in Māori value and based in values and with a kind of like series of different models and schemas for how we could have, a system, how we could leave the Westminster system behind.
I'm interested, again, with you talking, and when you watch your video, it's very clear what comes through is a respect for Māori as the first peoples of Aotearoa New Zealand, who never really ceded sovereignty, even if we signed the treaty. There's been a whole debate around tino rangatiratanga and the wording, kawanatanga, which means governorship, and and tino rangatiratanga, which means like absolute sovereignty. It means something else. And for me, your work, this work anyway, recognises strongly the significance of Māori as mana whenua, or tangata whenua, the people of Aotearoa. And I was really interested with you. Why is that important to you as a Fijian person, a person of Pacific descent who lives in Aotearoa, New Zealand? Can you talk to that, Luke?
Yeah. I suppose there are a few different answers from this. I'm a New Zealand citizen.
Yes.
It's where I grew up. I'm not really my connection to Fiji through my father is like it like takes place in the abstract. Like he was a diaspora person. I mean, he swam into the country.
Swam.
Yeah. And he kind of survived like the incredible racism.
Absolutely.
In the 70s, and kind of going home was never really possible for him, but also like to come to Aotearoa, like Fijians and Pacific people kind of course we all married Māori, of course we all became like some kind of, that is kind of a space I grew up in, that plural world.
Yep.
You know, like my father spoke Te Reo, and like my sister's husband was always at, would do karakia at dinner all the time. Like we totally like, I lived in that world that was made up of people from many different places, and I sometimes think that world seems like a little bit forgotten, but that's where I came from. But like, when I thought about this film, which is set in 2040, the one thing I felt was like absolutely likely, like the only thing I felt sure that I could predict was that come 2040 we would have large amounts of Pacific migrants who had become dispossessed due to climate change come to the shores.
Yeah.
And this isn't me being pessimistic, just, we know this for a fact, that the Western system would let us drown. It's already kind of letting us drown.
Yeah.
And so, like, Pacific life is dependent on our cousins in Aotearoa who have the most political power and are in the best shape. Like, it's that simple. And so I was thinking about this. My fate, or the fate of my people, is deeply bound to the fate of Māori. Like, we have a shared fate in that regard.
Thank you. I'm going to jump a little bit here because we're running out of time. I was also interested in this video. It really does outline the history of colonisation, including some of the legislation that disempowered Māori, and it makes clear what kind of happened through that colonial process. But the flip side to that, which is one thing that almost made me weep, was there's a roll call of people and Māori leaders who have kind of fought for that equity and change. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the rationale for putting that roll call of significant people from historical right through to contemporary in this work.
My team thought it was likely that, in Feb 6, 2040, when this speech happens for real, we thought it was likely that some acknowledgement for everyone who kind of like fought against this impossible system would kind of be named and acknowledged. And that was a basic function, but something happened during the editing stage where Te Kwan, who was doing the translation and the editing at that point, said to me like, "Oh, this should be shown to kids."
Yeah.
And we weren't totally even sure to include the roll call, but after she said that, I thought, this is a map that would be useful as a tool for schools. I tried to make this work in a way that had the same ethos as Matike Mai, which is incredibly accessible, and like written in this like simple non-art speech, but is still, totally liberatory. So I became so excited by that challenge, right? To make this quite democratic film. And the roll call, I think, just is useful. Like, just Google any of those names and you will be lucky.
There's a whole thing there. Maybe the final question is, I was also very interested in the symbolism in the work. Like, you shot in front of the Whare Rūnanga at Waitangi, and it's set in 2040, 200 years after the treaty's been signed. Again, Waitangi Day. And I was also interested in the casting of someone like Oreni Kaipara, who is actually a broadcaster, and she's very arresting as a soul figure in the video. Can you speak a little bit about some of the creative decisions you made in terms of casting and people like Oreni?
Yeah. I actually moved back to Aotearoa in 2020 after 10 years away, and I came back and I was in quarantine because it was still COVID, and I was spending 10 days in a hotel room doing absolutely nothing, and so the TV was on more than usual in my life, and Oreni had been given the position on Christmas Day, 2001, I guess, 2001, December 2001, to read the news and to be the first person with a moko kawai to do so. And honestly, I thought, what time is this? Where am I? This is not the place I left. And of course, there's a bit of naivety and a bit of optimism. The change was not so total, but I just can't, it just feels sort of burnt in my brain, watching her and thinking I would have never seen, I never thought I would see such a thing. And so because this work is so based in the question of decolonial TV, which is really rich and beautiful. In New Zealand, the land marches, 1975, you had artists filming and recording these movements because their skills were better spent on struggle than on gallery life. Yeah. And she's this moment, she's tied to mediated history. She's tied to that question of I guess the television is something, as my friend Tavi Nyong'o says, we only realized how haunted it was till we moved on to another form. And so I had became very convinced that there was something still there in this medium. And I thought she would be the person, her character is that she plays herself, and because she was who she was, she's been given the task to speak on behalf of the Rangatiratanga sphere. And so it seemed likely, but I never imagined anyone else but her. And I mean, she was incredible to work with. She rewrote a lot of the script. She didn't want to be credited as a writer, but she was just perfect for this job and this role, and it was amazing, actually.
Because she's a native speaker too. That's the other thing with, I mean, a lot of us lost language quite early. My family, my tribe, I think in the South Highland had the worst retention of Māori language. We had like 1% of people that could speak language. In Taranaki, very much the same. So someone like Orenega, she's Ngai Tūhoi, who were the last people kind of colonised. They have a purity to them because they have retained language, I feel anyway. So I thought that was I mean, the choice of her for me was quite extraordinary. And that was recorded purely in Te Reo, for me, is also an interesting kind of thing you've done. Of course, here it's in English, which I had to watch, and the Arabic subtitles, for me, I could only get some of it with the language. So, yeah, I'm just kind of interested in all of that. And I think she brings a power and a dynamism to that because it's only her, there's no other kind of characters. It's just, she starts off, as you said at the beginning, we were talking about it before, it's a karanga, and then she does a pau halfway through. All of that kind of stuff. So I was wanting to ask you two, as a very final question, do you think people in Aotearoa are ready for this conversation, or do you think they are fearful of a constitutional change such as this?
I think that there are cons to this system.
Cons?
There are pros and there are cons. Right? Any political system has such, right? And consensual democracy, which, you know, Lebanon, we can think of other places that have consensual democracies. These are not easy ways to work. So I don't think the utopianism is like at all the right way to approach this work. And me nor anyone else who worked on my film did so either. But I think the overriding sentiment is like, wouldn't you prefer a just system? Like, what would it like to live in a just system? And so if I could just like round out by saying a couple of last things about that, I see this work as a kind of rehearsal for liberation.
Right.
And there are two things that came to mind when I was getting ready to do this talk today around this just like question of the rehearsing liberation. And like the first was Eru Kapakingi, who was one of the organizers of the recent hikoi and protests, which I'm sure you've all seen, where he said the difference between a radical idea, you know, the thing about a radical idea is it just takes exposure before it becomes a kind of like viable idea. It's just time, it's just exposure, it's just seeing TV shows about it. It's just kind of like believing this thing that seems outrageous is viable. That's it. And then the second thing is like, I'm a total, like, I don't know, Dion Brand fanboy. I learned so much from the poet Dion Brand, and there was this piece of writing I came across recently, and I thought it kind of summed up what I was trying to do, and it goes like this. Revolutions happen in the vein. They change you and you change yourself. You wake up in the morning changing. You say, this is the human being I want to be. You are making yourself for the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Luke, very much. Great note to finish on.